The attorney for the bank finished her statement. She did not sit down. Instead, she straightened her jacket, a small, practiced gesture of finality. In the small claims courtroom, a room painted in a shade of beige that absorbed all light and sound, the gesture seemed definitive. Her voice was clear, reasonable. It was the sound of a simple matter being concluded. She spoke of bank policy, of standardized fee schedules, of the unfortunate but necessary costs of archival data retrieval. A $407 charge. Unpleasant, she conceded with a small professional smile, but correct. She looked at the judge, a man named Miller, who had been watching the ceiling fan for the last 10 minutes, and then gave a brief, almost pitying glance toward the back of the room. Toward the man who had brought them all here over the cost of a few photocopies. Judge Miller lowered his gaze from the fan. His eyes, heavy-lidded and patient, settled on the man in the third row. The man wore work boots, scuffed at the toes but clean. His flannel shirt was pressed. His hands, resting on his knees, were weathered in a way that officers could not produce. He held nothing but a long cardboard tube, capped at both ends. On one cap, written in faded black marker, was the number 117-B. The judge spoke, his voice a low gravel. "Let's hear from you, sir." The man stood. He did not speak. He walked forward, his steps even and unhurried on the worn linoleum floor. He placed the cardboard tube on the petitioner's table. The sound it made was a soft, hollow thud that seemed to quiet the room even further. The bank's attorney, Miss Davies, watched him, a smile tightening at the edges. She had places to be. This was scheduled for 15 minutes. They were already at 20. The room itself was a monument to minor disputes. The air was thick with the smell of old paper and stale coffee. The gallery held 3 other people, waiting for their own small grievances to be heard.
A dispute over a fence line, a complaint about a mechanic's bill, and this. A man in his late 50s suing the Great Plains Agribusiness Bank, a financial institution with assets in the billions, over $407. Ms. Davies represented the bank. Her name was Catherine Davies, and she was very good at her job. Her job was to make problems like this disappear with maximum efficiency and minimum cost. She saw the man not as a person, but as a file. Finch, Arthur. Account holder, deceased. Son and executor, same name. Disputing a standard fee. She had reviewed the file for all of 7 minutes that morning. It was open and shut. The man at the table still hadn't spoken. He was looking at the tube, not at her, not at the judge. He was a type she recognized. Quiet, stubborn, convinced of some small personal injustice that the world had no time for. These were usually the easiest to handle.
You let them have their say. You offered to waive half the fee as a gesture of goodwill, and you moved on. The institution always won, not by being right, but by being patient and permanent. Arthur Finch, though she did not yet know his name, seemed to have brought his own kind of patience into the room. It was a dense, heavy thing, far older than the bank's quarterly projections. Judge Miller leaned forward slightly. "Sir, do you have something to add?" The man looked up. His eyes were a pale, steady blue. He gave a single, slow nod. Then he reached for the cap on the cardboard tube. To understand why a man would sue a bank for $400, you have to go back 6 months. You have to go to the kitchen of a silent farmhouse where Arthur Finch sat with 3 shoeboxes filled with his father's papers. Thomas Finch had passed away at 87. He had been a man who believed in order, in balancing a ledger to the penny, in the quiet dignity of a job done right. For 40 years he had farmed 200 acres of corn and soy, and for 40 years he had documented every transaction, every planting season, every rainfall in a series of worn, cloth-bound notebooks. Arthur, his only son, was the executor of this quiet, orderly life. He spent his weekends driving out to the old farm, sorting through the material history of his father. He paid the last utility bills. He arranged for the sale of the farm equipment. He closed the credit accounts. The last task was the main bank account at Great Plains Agribusiness, the successor to the small-town bank his father had used his entire life. The final statement showed a balance of just over $7,000 and a deduction, a records retrieval fee of $407. Arthur called the bank. A polite young woman explained it was for pulling the old title records on a parcel of land associated with the original account mortgage from 1969.
But the mortgage was paid off in 1994, Arthur said.
That's correct, the woman replied, but the request to close the account triggered an archival search to ensure all liens were clear. It was standard procedure. It was bank policy. The words hung in the air, a wall he was not meant to question. He could have let it go. It was $400 out of $7,000. It was nothing in the grand scheme of things. But his father's voice was in his ear, a quiet echo from his childhood. The numbers have to balance. Always. He spent the next Saturday not in the house, but in the old office his father had kept in the corner of the main barn. It was cold, smelling of dust and dry earth and oil. Filing cabinets, the old metal kind, stood against one wall. Arthur started with a drawer labelled 1960 to 1970. He wasn't looking for anything specific. He was simply performing a duty. He was checking his father's work. He pulled out file after file, tax returns, receipts for seed, cancelled checks, written in his father's neat, angular script. It was slow, methodical work. The sun moved across the sky, casting long rectangles of light through the dusty barn windows. Hours passed. He found the file for the 1969 mortgage. Inside was a copy of the loan agreement from the original bank, the Farmers and Merchants Bank of Cedar Creek. It was for $30,000 to finance a new combine and the construction of an irrigation system. And stapled to the back of the loan, almost an afterthought, was a separate one-page document, an easement agreement. He read it once, then twice. It was dense with legal language, but the core of it was simple. In exchange for access to a creek that ran along the edge of the Finch property, the bank would provide the financing at a favourable rate. The creek was the town's primary water source, and the bank was helping to finance the municipal water project. But there was another clause, circled in his father's pencil.
Article 4, Section 2. It read, in consideration for the granting of this perpetual water access easement across parcel 117B, the lender, its successors and assigns, agrees to waive all administrative, clerical, and record-keeping fees associated with the accounts of Thomas Finch and his direct heirs for the lifetime of said accounts. Arthur sat back in the creaking wooden chair. He looked at the words, successors and assigns, for the lifetime of said accounts. He stood up and went to the large, flat file where his father kept old surveys and maps. He found the tube labeled 117-B. The memory was from when he was 10 years old. He was following his father along a stretch of land that was mostly useless for farming. It was a narrow strip, maybe 30 feet wide, thick with willow trees and scrub brush, following the curve of Cedar Creek. His father was carrying a surveyor's transit. Arthur carried the wooden stakes and a hammer. It was a hot July afternoon. His father set up the transit and squinted through the eyepiece. He motioned for Arthur to drive a stake into the ground. "What's this for, Dad?" he had asked. "Marking the line," his father said without looking up. "This is 117-B. It's important." "It doesn't look like much," Arthur had said. "Just rocks and weeds." Thomas Finch had finally looked up from the transit. He smiled, a rare small thing. "Some things aren't for growing crops, son. Some things are for making sure your neighbors have water to drink." He explained the deal he had just made with the bank. The town needed to expand its water system. The best place for the new intake was on their side of the creek.
The bank, which was financing the whole project, needed the easement from him to make it work. They offered me money for it, his father said, a few $1,000s. But money gets spent. An agreement, a promise, that's different. That's planted for the next man. He had pointed to the stake. This line is a promise.
The bank gets its water, and in return, they handle our paperwork. Forever. It's a fair trade. He taught Arthur that a man's worth wasn't in the money he made, but in the promises he kept. His word was his bond, but he also believed in writing things down. Not because he distrusted people, but because people forget. Institutions, he once told Arthur, have no memory. You have to be the memory. Arthur, sitting in the dusty barn office 50 years later, held the physical proof of that memory in his hands. The $407 fee was not an oversight. It was a broken promise. It was an institution that had forgotten. He would not sue for the money. He would sue to make them remember. Back in the present, Arthur twisted the cap off the cardboard tube. Miss Davies watched, a flicker of annoyance crossing her face. This was theatre, and she had no patience for it. She started to speak, to object on grounds of relevance, but Judge Miller raised a single, placid hand.
Let's see what the man has.
Arthur carefully slid a rolled-up document from the tube. It was a survey map, yellowed with age, the lines drawn in faded blue ink. He unrolled it on the table. It showed the layout of the Finch farm as it was in 1969. He used his finger, thick and calloused, to trace the path of Cedar Creek. Then he tapped a small, shaded strip of land running alongside it. "This is parcel 117-B, he said. His voice was quiet, but it carried in the still room. The fee the bank charged my father's estate was for retrieving the deed history on this parcel. Miss Davies let out a short, almost inaudible sigh. Your Honor, this is a simple fee dispute. An archival map from the 1960s has no bearing on our current automated service charge schedule. The judge looked at the paperwork the bank had submitted. He found the invoice for the fee. His eyes scanned the line items. He looked back at Arthur. He's right, Counselor.
The charge is specified as archival deed and title search, parcel 117-B. The open loop was closed. The number on the tube now had a meaning. Arthur then reached into the inside pocket of his coat. He pulled out a folded document, the paper soft and creased with age. He unfolded it and placed it on the table next to the map. This is the easement agreement for that parcel, he said. Signed July 10th, 1969. He slid it across the table toward the judge. Judge Miller picked it up. Miss Davies took a step forward as if to look. Arthur spoke again, his gaze fixed on the judge. Article 4, Section 2. According to this agreement, my father granted the original bank a perpetual water access easement. In exchange, the bank and all its successors agreed to waive all future administrative and record-keeping fees on the Finch family accounts, in perpetuity. A silence settled over the room. It was a different kind of silence now. The bored, waiting silence was gone. This was an active, listening silence. Miss Davies recovered quickly. She was a professional. This was just a wrinkle. Your Honour, she said, her tone regaining its confident, reasonable edge, that agreement was with the Farmers and Merchants Bank of Cedar Creek. As the court record shows, that entity was acquired by our institution, Great Plains Agribusiness, in 1988. Such ancillary clauses, particularly verbal-style agreements from that era, are very rarely grandfathered in corporate acquisitions of this nature. It's a legal and practical impossibility to track every such arrangement from every tiny bank bought over a 50-year period. Arthur Finch said nothing. He did not argue legal theory. He simply reached out a hand and tapped the paper in front of the judge. The judge looked down, found the passage, and read it aloud. This agreement's terms, covenants, and conditions are binding on all successors and assigns of both the grantor and the lender. Miss Davies' smile was gone. She shifted to her second angle, the practical one. Your Honor, even so, this is a 54-year-old document. It was clearly lost in the digital conversion of the archives. It's an oversight, not malice, a clerical error. The bank acknowledges the error. She turned to Arthur. We can, of course, waive the $407 fee. The matter is resolved. Arthur finally looked at her. His blue eyes were unblinking. The fee isn't the issue, he said. The agreement is. This was not going according to her script. She moved to her third and final angle, the one of dismissal, of making him seem unreasonable. Mr. Finch, with all due respect, what are you trying to accomplish here? This is a $400 argument over a forgotten piece of paper from a bygone era. Are you seeking damages? Compensation? What is the point? Arthur did not answer her. He turned his gaze back to the judge, the only person in the room whose opinion seemed to matter to him. I just want to know if the agreement was honored. Judge Miller looked from Arthur to Miss Davies, and then back to the documents on his desk. He had been a judge in this county for 28 years. He had seen corporate lawyers try to flatten local farmers, and he had seen farmers try to cheat corporations. He was a neutral arbiter, but he was also a man who understood the local history. He remembered the old Farmers and Merchants Bank. He remembered when the big agribusiness bank bought them out. He picked up the easement agreement again, feeling the texture of the old paper. He looked at the signatures, Thomas Finch, and a man named Howard Sterling, the old bank president. He remembered Howard, dead 15 years now. He turned to the county clerk, an older woman named Mary, who sat at a small table by the wall. Mary, he said, could you please pull the county's recorded file for parcel 117-B? Specifically, any easements filed in the summer of 1969. Mary nodded, stood, and left the courtroom. The room waited. Miss Davies stood stiffly, checking the time on her phone. She was trying to project an air of impatience, of a busy professional being held up by trivialities, but a small muscle in her jaw was twitching. Arthur Finch sat down at the petitioner's table. He folded his hands and waited. He looked perfectly calm, as if he could sit there all day. The three other people in the gallery were no longer looking at their phones. They were watching the empty doorway through which the clerk had disappeared. The silence stretched. 1 minute. 3. 5. The slow ticking of the clock on the wall was the only sound. Finally, Mary returned. She was carrying a large, heavy ledger, its leather cover cracked with age. She placed it on the judge's bench and with practiced hands opened it to a page marked with a slip of paper. The judge leaned over to look. Mary ran a finger down a column of handwritten entries. Her voice was soft when she spoke. Easement. Recorded July 12, 1969. Grantor, Thomas Finch. Grantee, Farmers and Merchants Bank of Cedar Creek, for parcel 117-B. She paused. With perpetual covenants as attached in Exhibit A, binding on all successes. She then looked at the document Arthur had brought. Her eyes scanned it. This appears to be the original of Exhibit A. The air went out of the room. Miss Davies stood frozen for a moment. The chain of evidence was complete. The private agreement, the public record, the bank's own fee statement. They all pointed to the same unavoidable truth. She had walked into the room to swat away a $400 nuisance and had instead walked into a legally binding perpetual contract a multi-billion-dollar client had been violating for decades. Her composure, the product of a top-tier law school and years of corporate litigation, cracked. She quickly turned away, pulling out her phone and typing a rapid series of text messages. Her face was pale. Judge Miller watched her, his expression unreadable. He looked at Arthur, who had not moved. He seemed to be the least surprised person in the room. After a few moments, Miss Davies turned back. Her entire demeanour changed. The confidence was gone, replaced by a forced, brittle pleasantry. Your Honour, Mr. Finch, on behalf of the bank, I wish to extend our sincerest apologies for this deeply regrettable oversight. We will, of course, refund the $407 immediately and ensure that Mr. Finch's accounts are flagged so that this never happens again. Furthermore, in light of the inconvenience and his diligence in bringing this to our attention, the bank would like to offer Mr. Finch a settlement of $10,000 to dissolve this outdated agreement and clear the title. It was a good offer, a quick, clean end to the problem. She looked at Arthur, expecting relief, perhaps even gratitude. The judge looked at Arthur. "No," Arthur said.
The single word was not loud, but it was absolute. Miss Davies blinked.
I beg your pardon, Mr. Finch, that is a very generous offer. 25 times the amount of the original dispute.
Arthur's gaze was steady. The agreement stands. I'm not selling the covenant. She couldn't understand it. It made no sense from a financial perspective.
But why? The fee waiver is a negligible value. The agreement itself has no modern utility. It's just paper.
Arthur spoke, his voice still quiet, but now with a sharp edge of precision. The agreement isn't just about fees. Read Article 5, Land in lieu. It states the collateral for the original $30,000 loan wasn't the farm. It was the water rights to the creek that runs through parcel 117-B. The bank has been using those rights for 54 years. My father's ledger shows the loan was for the town's irrigation infrastructure. The bank never paid for the water. The rights were the collateral.
Now that the bank has broken the agreement, the collateral must be returned or paid for. Miss Davies looked like she had been punched. She knew exactly what he was talking about. 3 months ago, Great Plains Agribusiness Bank had finalized the sale of a massive portfolio of unallocated water rights to a corporate farming consortium for a regional development project. The centerpiece of that portfolio, the asset that made the entire deal possible, were the primary drawing rights from Cedar Creek, a sale valued at $18 million. They had sold something they had never owned. Judge Miller looked down at the agreement in his hands, then at the map, then at the pale face of the bank's attorney. He saw the entire picture now, clear as day. This was never about $400. This was about a 54-year-old promise, meticulously recorded and quietly kept by one man and an institution that had cashed the checks for decades without ever remembering what it had promised in return. The judge looked at Miss Davies. "Counselor," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion, "it appears your client has a significant problem. This matter is well beyond the scope of this court. Case dismissed." He struck his gavel once. The sound was like a crack in the foundation of the room. There was no celebration. There was no triumphant speech. Arthur Finch did not smile or pump his fist. He simply stood, his duty done. He walked to the judge's bench. "May I have my papers back?" he asked. Judge Miller slid the map and the easement agreement across the polished wood. Arthur took them. He walked back to the petitioner's table. Methodically, he rolled the old survey map, its edges soft as cloth. He slid it back into the cardboard tube and secured the cap.
He folded the easement agreement along its original creases and placed it carefully into his inside coat pocket. He gave a single respectful nod to Judge Miller. Then he turned and walked out of the courtroom, his work boots making no sound on the floor.
Miss Davies remained standing, her phone held loosely in her hand. She was staring at the empty space on the table where the old documents had been. The foundation of an $18 million deal had just been washed away by a dead man's promise and his son's patience. The institution had forgotten, and now it was going to have to pay to remember. The sun was low in the sky, casting the long shadow of the old barn across the yard. Arthur Finch stood at the edge of his property by a sagging wire fence that marked the boundary of parcel 117-B. Below him, in the dimming light, Cedar Creek moved silently through the trees.
The water was dark and cool,
The same water that had flowed here when his father was a boy. The same water that had been the subject of a promise made in a small-town bank half a century ago. He could hear the quiet hum of the municipal intake pump a half-mile downstream, a sound that had been part of the background noise of his entire life, a sound he now understood in a completely different way. It was the sound of a debt being collected, day after day, for 54 years. He reached into his shirt pocket and took out his father's old notebook. It was a small, pocket-sized ledger with a worn black cover. He opened it to the first clean page. With a simple pen in a script almost identical to his father's, he wrote a single entry. The date, and then the words, account closed, balance 0.00. He closed the notebook and put it away. He did not think about the $18 million. He did not think about the frantic phone calls now happening at the bank's headquarters. He thought only of the clean, satisfying zero, a balanced book, a promise kept. He stood there for a long time, watching the water flow, a quiet man on a quiet piece of land. Some men build empires, others just make sure the books balance. It turns out, sometimes, they are the same thing. If this story stayed with you, there's another worth knowing. Down in the Texas Panhandle, a woman named Maria Reyes inherited her grandmother's sewing box. Inside, under a spool of thread, was a single receipt for a registered bull from 1948. A bull everyone thought had been lost in a fire. We'll see what that receipt is worth. Stay with us.